The dust, fine as powdered bone, settled on Jedediah Thorne's worn hat brim as his horse, Goliath, picked a careful path through the skeletal remains of what was once a pine forest, ravaged by a fire 2 summers past. A silence, heavy and unnatural, pressed in on him, broken only by the creak of saddle leather and the sigh of a wind that carried no relief, only the scent of distant rain and something else, something acrid and wrong. His eyes, the color of a stormy sky, scanned the barren landscape, seeking nothing in particular, yet always wary. Grief had been his companion for 5 long years, a shadow that clung tighter than his own. He'd thought the desolate quiet of this high country might offer some solace, but peace was a currency he no longer seemed to possess. Then he saw it. Against the bleached white trunk of a lone, surviving aspen, a splash of dark color that didn't belong. Goliath snorted, ears pricked, sensing the wrongness before Jedediah's mind fully registered the horror. He urged the gelding closer, his heart a cold stone in his chest. A small figure, impossibly small, dangled from a stout lower branch, a crude rope cinched tight. Below the limp form, nailed to the tree with brutal efficiency, was a freshly planed piece of wood, letters daubed in what looked like tar, "No mercy from the white man's rope." The word struck Jedediah with the force of a physical blow, each letter a brand seared into his vision. He was off Goliath in an instant, his movements economical, honed by a past he rarely spoke of. His gaze, sharp and assessing, took in the slight frame, the dark hair fanned out against the pale bark. A girl, Chinese by her features, no older than his own Sarah would have been. A strangled sound, something between a curse and a prayer, tore from his throat. His hand, calloused and scarred, went to the hunting knife at his belt. There was no hesitation, only a grim purpose that settled over his weathered face like a death mask. He cut the rope with a single, decisive slash, catching the fragile weight as it fell. She was light, terrifyingly so. He laid her gently on the parched earth, his fingers searching for a pulse at her neck, expecting nothing. But then, a flicker, faint as a moth's wing, beneath his touch. Alive! Barely. His eyes shot back to the sign, its message of hate a vile stain on the already blighted land. A cold fury, an emotion he'd thought long buried with his wife and child, began to smolder deep within him. This was not justice. This was not the work of men, but of something far darker. He looked down at the girl, her face pale, a dark bruise blooming beneath the rope's cruel embrace. Who were they, these creatures who proclaimed such merciless judgment? And what right had they? The wind whispered through the dead pines, a mournful dirge. Jedediah Thorne, a man who had sought only to be left alone with his ghosts, found himself at a crossroads he never anticipated. To turn away was to let the darkness win, to affirm the hateful message on that tree. To act was to re-enter a world of pain and conflict he had desperately tried to escape. He looked at the girl's face again, her eyelids fluttering almost imperceptibly. In that small movement, he saw not just a victim, but a spark of defiance against the overwhelming void. His decision was made, not in a torrent of words, but in the sudden, hard set of his jaw and the rekindled light in his desolate eyes. He carefully gathered her into his arms, her small body a stark contrast to his rugged strength. The sign remained on the tree, a testament to cruelty, but as Jedediah turned his back on it, carrying his fragile burden, it seemed to lose some of its power, a silent challenge issued to the vast, uncaring sky. What path does a man choose when confronted by such blatant evil, when the ghosts of his past rise to demand he not make the same mistakes again? If you were standing in Jedediah's worn boots, seeing that innocent life hanging by a thread, what would your heart have told you to do? Jedediah carried the girl back to his isolated ranch, a modest spread nestled in a small, defensible valley miles from the nearest settlement of Redemption Gulch. The journey was slow, agonizingly so, each jolt of Goliath's steady gait a potential threat to the fragile life he held. He spoke to her in low murmurs, words of reassurance he wasn't sure she could hear or understand if she did. "Hold on, little one. Just hold on." His cabin was sparse, utilitarian, reflecting the man himself. A stone hearth, a rough-hewn table, a single cot. He laid her there, on the cot that had once held his Sarah during her fevers, the irony a bitter pill. For days, she hovered between worlds. He cleaned the raw, angry welts on her neck, applied a poultice of comfrey and yarrow, remedies his wife, Mourning Dove, had taught him from her people. He coaxed sips of water, then thin broth, between her cracked lips. Her hands, when he cleaned them, were small, the fingers delicate, yet there were calluses there too, signs of work, of a life already touched by hardship even before this atrocity. He watched her breathe, shallow and uneven, and each breath was a victory against the shadow that clung to her. During the long, silent vigils, his own past came visiting, unbidden and unwelcome. He saw Sarah's bright smile, heard her laughter echoing in the empty rooms of his memory, felt the phantom touch of her hand in his. He remembered the fire, the screams, the helplessness as raiders, drunk on whiskey and their own perceived power, had swept through their small homestead further south, leaving nothing but ashes and a grief that had hollowed him out. He had fought then, fought like a demon, but it hadn't been enough. The authorities had called it an isolated incident, a tragedy. But Jedediah knew it was born of the same bitter wellspring as the sign on that aspen tree, a hatred that saw others as less than human, as obstacles to be removed. He saw the girl's eyes flutter open on the fourth day. They were dark, almond-shaped, and filled with a terror so profound it made his own hardened heart ache. He didn't speak, just met her gaze steadily, trying to convey reassurance without words. She flinched when he reached out, a small, wounded animal. "Easy," he said, his voice rough from disuse. "You're safe here." He learned her name was Mai. She spoke little, her English hesitant, broken. But her eyes were intelligent, perceptive. She watched him, tracked his movements, the fear slowly, almost imperceptibly, receding, replaced by a cautious curiosity. She would touch the raw skin of her neck, her expression unreadable, then her gaze would find his, a silent question in their depths. He didn't press her for details of her ordeal. The trauma was a visible shroud around her. Instead, he spoke of the land, of the hawk that nested in the cliffs above his valley, of the coming winter. He showed her how to grind corn, how to mend a tear in his rough-spun shirt, small tasks to occupy her hands and mind. And slowly, a resilience began to bloom in the barren soil of her fear. A faint smile when he brought her a handful of late-season berries. A quiet determination as she mastered a new task. She was, he realized, a survivor. Her spirit, though battered, was not broken. The rope had not claimed her. The sign had lied. Mercy, it seemed, could still be found, even if it had to be carved out of the wilderness by a man haunted by his own failures to provide it in the past. He saw in Mai not a replacement for Sarah, but a chance, perhaps, to honor her memory in a way that mere survival never could. A chance to stand against the darkness he had fled from once before. When Mai was strong enough, though still bearing the shadows of her ordeal in the haunted depths of her eyes, Jedediah knew he couldn't keep her hidden in his valley forever. The ones who had done this to her were still out there. They believed her dead, most likely, but that kind of evil, left unchecked, would only fester and spread. He had to go to Redemption Gulch. He left Mai with strict instructions to stay hidden, a rifle he'd taught her the basics of leaning near the door, though the thought of her needing it chilled him to the bone. The town of Redemption Gulch was a raw, sprawling collection of clapboard buildings and muddy streets, buzzing with the nervous energy of a place built on precarious hopes and easily broken dreams. Saloons and supply stores stood shoulder to shoulder with assay offices and a single, stark church. As Jedediah rode Goliath down the main thoroughfare, he felt the familiar weight of eyes upon him. He was known here, but not well. A recluse, a man who kept his own counsel. Some whispered he was running from something, others that he was simply a man who preferred solitude. He tied Goliath in front of the marshal's office, a small, unassuming building with a faded sign. Marshal Brody was a man weathered by the frontier, his face a roadmap of compromises and hard choices. He listened to Jedediah's terse account, his expression growing grimmer with each word. Brody's eyes, though, held a flicker of something Jedediah hadn't expected, a weary anger, not just surprise. "A Chinese girl, you say?" Brody finally spoke, his voice low. "There's been trouble. Silas Blackwood, he runs the freight lines, brought in a crew of Chinese for the new railroad spur. Paying them next to nothing. Some locals ain't happy. Been talk? Jedediah's gaze sharpened. Talk, Marshal? Or a lynching? Brody ran a hand over his tired face. Blackwood's a big man in this town, Thorn. Owns a lot of people, one way or another. He claims some of his Chinese workers stole from him. Stirred up a hornet's nest. His eyes met Jedediah's. The sign? No mercy from the white man's rope. That's Blackwood's brand of poison. He likes to make examples. The air in the small office grew thick. Jedediah could see the struggle in the marshal's eyes, the desire for justice warring with the pragmatic need to keep a semblance of peace, even if it was a peace bought with fear and complicity. He needs to be stopped, Jedediah stated, his voice flat, devoid of emotion, yet carrying an undeniable weight. Brody looked out the dusty window at the town, at the people scurrying by, many of whom likely knew more than they let on. The cowardly crowd, silent in the face of tyranny. Stopping Blackwood ain't like swatting a fly, Thorn. He's got men. He's got influence. He paused. And what proof do you have, other than the girl's word, assuming she'll even speak of it? Jedediah's hand instinctively went to the hilt of the knife still at his belt, the one that had cut my down. His eyes were like chips of ice. I have the girl. She's alive. That's proof enough that his examples failed. He then recounted, briefly, his own past, the loss that drove him, not as a plea for sympathy, but as a statement of unwavering resolve. He wouldn't let it happen again. A new light flickered in Brody's eyes. Maybe it was Jedediah's quiet intensity, or the stark horror of the crime, or perhaps his own buried conscience finally stirring. If what you say is true, if Blackwood ordered this, then he's crossed a line even this town won't stomach once it's laid bare. But his voice lacked true conviction. The fear of Blackwood was a palpable thing. Jedediah knew then he might be on his own, or at least, he'd have to force the marshal's hand. He left the office, the weight of the town's silent complicity pressing down on him. He needed more than just the marshal. He needed to find the cracks in Blackwood's armor, the fear in his men. His quest for justice was also a search for his own redemption, a redemption that could only be found by facing down the darkness, not running from it. The name Silas Blackwood was now etched in his mind, a name synonymous with the evil that had tried to steal Mai's life. Silas Blackwood did not take kindly to whispers of his failures, nor to challenges to his authority. Word reached him, as it always did in a town laced with his informants and debtors, of Jedediah Thorn's inquiries, of the marshal's sudden interest in the Chinese problem. Blackwood, a man whose girth spoke of indulgence and whose small, piggish eyes missed nothing that affected his profits, saw Thorn not as a threat, but an annoyance to be swatted. He sent 3 of his men, burly, swaggering types who mistook brutality for strength, to Thorn's isolated ranch. They rode in brazenly, not expecting resistance from a lone recluse. They found Jedediah outside, mending a fence line, his movements calm, almost placid, as they approached. Mai was inside the cabin, her presence a secret he guarded fiercely. Thorn, the lead rider, a scar-faced man named Cletus, barked. Mr. Blackwood wants a word. Seems you been poking your nose where it don't belong. But Jedediah straightened slowly, his gaze sweeping over them, cold and appraising. His hands, empty, hung loosely at his sides. This is my land. My business. Cletus chuckled, a harsh, grating sound. Everything in this territory is Mr. Blackwood's business, one way or another. Especially when it concerns his property. His eyes flicked towards the cabin. Heard you found something that went missing. Jedediah's expression didn't change, but a stillness settled over him, the dangerous calm before a storm. The only thing I found was a child, half dead, left as carrion by cowards. The men bristled. Watch your mouth, old man, another one snarled, his hand inching towards his Colt. We ain't here to palaver. Blackwood wants the girl. Says she's a thief. She's under my protection, Jedediah stated, his voice low but carrying the clear ring of finality. It cut through the air like a well-honed blade. And she's not for sale, or for the taking. Cletus spurred his horse a step closer, towering over Jedediah. You got 2 choices, Thorn. Hand her over peaceful like, or we burn this place to the ground with you and her in it. Mr. Blackwood ain't a patient man." It was then that a small face appeared in the cabin window, eyes wide with fear, but also a flicker of something else, defiance, perhaps learned from the quiet man who had saved her. My! The sight of her seemed to confirm their suspicions and embolden them. Cletus grinned, a predatory flash of teeth. "Well, well. Looks like the rumors were true." He dismounted, along with his companions. "Last chance." Thorn Jedediah's eyes flicked to Mai, a silent reassurance, then back to the men. He saw the contempt in their faces, the casual cruelty. He saw the same arrogance he'd seen in the eyes of the men who had destroyed his past. The sleeping giant within him, dormant for so long, began to stir, a righteous fury coiling tight. "There's a third choice," Jedediah said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, yet each word was clear and distinct. "You leave. Now. And you tell Blackwood his reign of terror over the helpless ends today." The men laughed. Cletus drew his gun. Brave words, farmer, but as Cletus raised his weapon, Jedediah moved. He wasn't a farmer. Not just a farmer. The speed was startling, a blur of motion that belied his years. His hand darted inside his vest, emerging with an old Navy Colt, its barrel worn smooth. Before Cletus could comprehend, Jedediah's shot cracked the air, not aimed to kill, but to disarm. Cletus yelped as his gun spun from his grasp, his hand throbbing. The other two, stunned by the sudden violence, fumbled for their own weapons. Jedediah didn't hesitate. He was a whirlwind of controlled fury, moving with a deadly grace. He used his fists, the butt of his pistol, his entire being focused on neutralizing the threat. It was brutal, efficient, and swift. When the dust settled, the three men were groaning on the ground, disarmed and thoroughly beaten. Jedediah stood over them, chest heaving slightly, the Colt steady in his hand. His eyes, however, burned with a cold fire. Just then, two riders crested the ridge overlooking the valley. Marshal Brody, and, surprisingly, a small posse of townsmen, their faces grim, armed. Brody had made his choice. Perhaps Jedediah's earlier words had struck a deeper chord, or perhaps the blatant aggression of Blackwood's men, reported by a worried neighbor, had been the final straw. "Looks like you handled the welcoming committee, Thorn," Brody said, a reluctant admiration in his voice. He looked at the bruised and battered men. "These dogs will testify, or they'll swing for attempted murder alongside their master." The fight wasn't over, but the tide had turned. One man's stand had ignited a spark. The apprehension of Silas Blackwood was less a battle and more the inevitable collapse of a rotten edifice once its foundations were shaken. With his enforcers captured and their coerced testimony painting a damning picture of his orders to lynch Mai as a terrifying example to his other exploited laborers, Blackwood's bravado crumbled. Marshal Brody, now fully committed and backed by a townsfolk suddenly finding their courage, or perhaps just eager to align with the winning side, faced little resistance when they went to arrest him at his opulent office above the freight company. Blackwood, stripped of his hired guns and bluster, was just a paunchy, sweating man, his eyes darting about for an escape that no longer existed. His claims of innocence were hollow, his threats impotent. The law, so often a tool he had bent to his will, now turned its implacable face towards him. The trial was swift. Mai, with Jedediah by her side, did not have to speak much. Her presence, the still fading marks on her neck, and the recovered sign, "No mercy" from the white man's rope, spoke volumes more eloquently than any prosecutor. The rope itself, the one Jedediah had cut, became a stark symbol of Blackwood's depravity. Some townsfolk, those who had benefited from Blackwood's reign or feared him, stayed away. But many others came, their faces a mixture of shame and a dawning resolve. They had allowed the shadow of men like Blackwood to grow too long in their midst. They saw in Jedediah Thorn not a vengeful outcast, but a reflection of the courage they had lacked. They saw in Mai not a faceless foreigner, but a child who had suffered an unimaginable horror under their very noses. Blackwood was found guilty. Justice, in the flawed way of mortals, was served. He wouldn't hang from a tree with a mocking sign, but the bars of the territorial prison would be their own kind of rope, slowly tightening around the rest of his miserable life. In the aftermath, Redemption Gulch felt different. The air was cleaner, somehow. The fear that had been a constant undercurrent had lessened. People looked each other in the eye a little more readily. Mrs. Albright, the kind woman who ran the general store and had once offered Jedediah a sympathetic ear, organized a small collection for a new life, a fresh start. In the weeks that followed, began to truly heal. The haunted look in her eyes didn't vanish entirely. Some scars, Jedediah knew, ran too deep for that, but it softened, often replaced by a shy smile or a thoughtful gaze. She learned more English, her quick mind absorbing everything. She helped Jedediah around the ranch, her small hands surprisingly deft. She planted a small patch of wildflowers near Sarah's unmarked grave, a splash of color in the monochrome landscape of his grief. Jedediah Thorne did not return to his solitude. He had found something in defending something he thought irretrievably lost, a purpose beyond mere survival. He had stared into the abyss of human cruelty and had not blinked. He had offered mercy where none was given, and in doing so, had found a measure of his own redemption. He was still a quiet man, his words few, but they carried a new weight, the weight of a man who had faced his ghosts and chosen to fight for the living. He became Mai's guardian, her protector, and in a way, she became his. Her resilience, her quiet strength, was a daily reminder that even in the deepest darkness, hope could take root. The valley was still a harsh land, and the world beyond still held its measure of injustice. But for one man and one child, a fragile peace had been forged, a testament to the courage it takes to stand against the tide, to answer hatred with an unwavering defense of the innocent. What does it take for one person to break the cycle of fear and violence? Jedediah chose his path. What choices do we make when faced with the suffering of others? If this tale of courage found in forsaken places has stirred your spirit, there are more echoes in these canyons, more stories of the human heart battling the darkness. Follow this channel, lend your strength to the telling, and subscribe so that such deeds and such hope are never forgotten.